few weeks ago, I wrote a post about game theory, assurance contracts, and crowdfunding via Bitcoin. And since then, a lot of people have reached out expressing interest in these ideas. So I decided to make a video kind of expanding on what I wrote previously. A lot of my ideas on the matter are rooted, as I mentioned, in game theory. And in game theory, there is a problem that's known as the free rider problem. And basically what this means is that there are situations in which the creation of a public good, for example, building a lighthouse or a road, would provide utility and add value to a certain group of people and essentially leave everybody better off. However, in many cases, there's no way of excluding people who did not contribute to funding the project from actually using whatever item was created. So in that case, a rational actor would make the decision not to contribute because if they can still derive the value without actually having to pay for it, then obviously that's an advantage to them. However, when everybody starts to do this, it can actually result in the public good not being created at all, and therefore everybody else having lower utility as well. So an assurance contract is basically an attempt to solve this problem by creating a binding contract in which a group of people agrees to fund a certain public good at the point where a certain financial threshold is met. And if the project is fully funded, then the public good is created. And if it's not, then the money is returned to the people who had pledged that they were going to pay for it at the beginning. So a dominant assurance contract is basically an assurance contract in which we factor in the concept of a dominant strategy, which again is rooted in game theory. And in game theory, a dominant strategy is one that is always the best course of action or the best thing to do, regardless of what the other actors or parties in any given scenario are doing. So in an assurance contract like the one I just described, where, for instance, a community is trying to fund a lighthouse, a dominant strategy would involve having, an entrepreneur or government, basically, agree to pay a certain amount of money back to the contributors in the event that the project was not fully funded. So essentially, it would be something like I get whatever I put in back plus, let's say, 10% or $10 or whatever it is. So this increases the risk for the entrepreneur because they may not end up net zero, but they might end up actually losing money on the project. But it also increases the probability that the project will be funded. So for potential contributors, it's always in their best interest to participate because in one scenario, they get the creation of the public good, which obviously they were interested in from the beginning. And in the other scenario, they get the money that they put in back plus some. So that's kind of the idea of a dominant assurance contract. But even regular assurance contracts, because they're binding, dictate the fact that there must actually be somebody enforcing it. And so previously, this has always been somebody like a third party, so that could be a mediator or something to that effect, or a government or whatnot. But this can be problematic in certain scenarios, particularly ones where there's not necessarily an impartial party that can be found, or somebody who can be trusted to operate fairly. In international scenarios, this is practically impossible because there's no such thing as like an overarching impartial body. And even something like the United Nations, which you might think would be impartial, is basically fully reliant on member countries for its funds, and therefore it doesn't really have any autonomy of its own. So in situations like these, having an independent arbiter who doesn't have a vested interest in either side of the equation and who could actually allow this to happen, though, would be huge. And the reason Bitcoin is so interesting here is that since it's a technology rather than a person or an institution, it's, not really corruptible. So if we look at the applications of assurance contracts, what we see nowadays, people don't necessarily refer to them as assurance contracts, but they're crowdfunding platforms. So, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, blah, blah, blah. And they operate as the third party that I've just described, which collects funding from the backers and then releases the money to the project creator once the funding threshold is met. So, as I mentioned with Bitcoin, the need for this third party is removed and the process can be handled by technology. So, I'll break it down a little bit in terms of how this would actually work. So, let's say we have Alice and Bob, as usual, and Alice is an entrepreneur, and she decides to fundraise for the launch of her new product. So she tells everybody that she's going to create this awesome new spaceship if she can raise 100 Bitcoins. And she opens up contributions to everybody, and she creates a new address to which people are supposed to send the Bitcoins. So everybody who wants to contribute creates a new transaction that spends whatever amount they've decided to pledge to the project to the new address that Alice just created. But they don't broadcast their transaction. And there are a few differences here from a regular transaction. So contributors can't have any change, which means that if they don't have an address with an output of the amount that they're trying to send, then they can create a new one by spending money to one of their own addresses. It's a little bit complicated, not the smoothest process, and we'll have to figure out a better way to do that, but that's kind of how it would work in general. The input script signature is signed with sig hash all and sig hash anyone can pay. The output value is set to 100 Bitcoins, which Alice said is the threshold for creating her rocket ship. So the transaction is then uploaded to Alice's server, which saves it to disk, and then it keeps account of how many Bitcoins have been pledged, so how close she is to the funding threshold that she's established. When the funding threshold is met, the server merges the individual transactions all together into one transaction with only one output. And that output is then spendable to the address that Alice created. And the inputs are collected from the contributors. So at that point, the funds are actually taken away from them. Before, the transaction couldn't actually complete, even though people had pledged to spend the money, because in any given Bitcoin transaction, the inputs and the outputs have to match. So, if I send you 5 Bitcoins, you can't get 7 Bitcoins out. That's impossible. It doesn't work. So if any individual person pledged, say, 10 Bitcoins, but Alice had said that the output of the transaction needed to be 100 Bitcoins, then that wouldn't complete until the sum of all the Bitcoins that were pledged equaled 100, which is the desired output. So when the total contributions reach the 100 Bitcoin threshold, then the inputs match the outputs, the transaction becomes valid. And then, at that point, the final transaction is broadcast to the network and sends the contributions to Alice's address. So how does this work? I mean, why does it work, really? Basically, the protocol has several properties which make it perfect for crowdfunding and make the process that I just described actually feasible. So one of these is, as I mentioned, the fact that the transaction isn't valid if inputs don't match outputs. So this means that Alice can't spend the Bitcoins that she receives until the threshold is met. So this ensures that contributors can send her pledges safely and know that she's not just going to grab 50 Bitcoins and then make off with it like a bandit. And she can only really spend them once the total project is funded. The other part of this that's important in terms of the protocol is the fact that SIG hash all means that every part of the transaction is signed with the exception of the input scripts. And this is really important because it allows the inputs to change, which is what happens every time a new pledge is made toward the total count of pledges, without breaking the transaction. If the outputs change, however, the transaction does break. So in that case, it would become invalid and it wouldn't go through. With SIG hash anyone can pay, basically it's an additional modifier that means that the signature only covers the inputs that it's found in, and the other inputs are not signed and therefore can be anything. So they're not predetermined. So I guess that kind of covers how the transaction would basically work, and hopefully my explanation earlier gave a little bit of color as to why you would actually want to do this using Bitcoin as opposed to using anything else. And I think it's particularly fascinating because it basically allows you to abstract to technology what could be a very manual process of collecting funds. It eliminates the need for a possibly corruptible and or incompetent third party who needs to be involved and who may not even be feasible in certain situations, like I mentioned, at the international level. And it's really, really, it can be used for, a huge variety of applications. So basically it's pretty awesome. Mike Hearn, some of you may have seen him present his new project Lighthouse, and as of right now it's not public, it's not really usable. He said he's still working on it, but it's really, really interesting and you should definitely check it out. It's basically allowing for the process that I've just described using Bitcoin. So it's pretty much at the forefront of what I've seen in that space. Anyways, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. There's a contact form on my website. It's ariannasimpson.com/contact. That's about it. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye.